Hello, my name is Américo Mendoza-Mori. I am from Peru, but I currently live in Boston and I do research on Quechua and Andean culture. I did study literature as an undergrad, and I did that in Peru, in San Marcos University, which is a public university in Lima. And everything that was considered literature was something that was published, that was part of a book. And therefore, all of the storytelling, music, and oral traditions were left out. They were not considered literature per se. But then we were able to identify that in everyday life, in festivities, in family gatherings, in community gatherings, there was so much literature production, but that was not recognized as such by the studies I was doing as an undergrad. At the same time, I was able to work with other professors when I was a student who were actually trying to challenge that notion that literature could also be found in oral platforms. And probably now that's a more accepted idea. That was certainly not the case back in the days. And therefore, when connecting with communities in Lima, which are mostly migrant descent, the presence of indigenous languages was very important. And therefore, if we wanted to get a fair picture of narratives and cultural production, we had to first expand our notions of literature, and second, to recognize that much of that literature was produced in other languages. And into a bigger extent, recognizing different narratives is not just for academic purposes, but on how do we see ourselves as a society. So expanding the notions of how we craft our stories and therefore our identity stories, also connected into a personal level, in the sense that how these spaces that tell us to, let's say, or help us to be more professional or to then get a job or to grow as adults are not enabling us to incorporate these cultural aspects of our identities. That first challenge who we are and who do we see ourselves. In my particular case, as someone from Peru, sometimes these nation states that were created in the 19th century, they didn't know how to handle indigenous cultures because they were seen as something from the past, that's something that had nothing to provide to contemporary society, even worse, nothing to provide to the future. So the embracing, which is still an ongoing process, of those different aspects also makes me think of what kind of society we want to build. And now that I do research on Quechua and on the Andes, I always tend to ask myself if in this notion or an ambition in the future of, or the present of indigenous or Andean culture or Peruvian culture, do I see the presence of indigenous languages? And I want to, and I hope that when we think of the future, we can also see Quechua and other languages present. Not just, and I try to avoid seeing that my work is just about rescuing languages, but instead of making sure that they are already, Quechua is spoken by millions of people today. So certainly it's not a language of the past. And we can make sure by, let's say, being more open for those of us who are from the Andean region, to be open that even if we don't speak the language, there's a presence in our everyday life. When we look at words, at expressions, particularly in my case, I'm from a region called Ica in Peru, which is in the southern coast of the country. And in Peru, and something similar happens in Ecuador, since the arrival of the Europeans, they divided the region into three parts: the coast, the Andes, and the Amazon. And for some reason, people tend to believe that those divisions are very, let's say, rigid even today. So people might say, oh, I am from the coast, therefore I am not Andean. Or I am from the Amazon, therefore I'm not Andean, either way. When in reality, during the Inca Empire, the notion of regions was more fluid. And thanks to archaeological work, we can see that very iconic symbols of what people think Andean identity and Andean culture is were very present in the coast. For instance, the oldest quena, which is a flute pan, the oldest one was found in Ica. And that, maybe for a foreigner, all Peru or all the Andes might look like the same. Of course, they're the same region. But for locals, people tend to make those distinctions. And learning more about that also even helped me think of how, let's say, more fluid should be the understanding of Quechua and Andean identity, especially because coastal cities, because they were the centers of colonial power, Guayaquil, Lima, and other cities in the coast, even today, they still carry that colonial legacy of saying that we are not indigenous or we don't have any connection to indigeneity. So acknowledging that can help us embrace more and appreciate that Quechua is more present than we really think it is. And ultimately, when we say that Quechua is more present, it's not just about the abstraction of the language, but the knowledges that language carries, and therefore the recognition of their speakers who still face discrimination. I guess the realization that behind every language, there's a community of speakers, and there's a depository of traditions of knowledge that have had a great impact on my work, in the sense that even though it started out of curiosity when I was a student, it also became a powerful tool to connect with my different cultural heritage as someone from the Andean region. Again, first, I starting by the fact that now I'm more happy and comfortable to say that I am Andean, because back in the day, my mother is from the Amazon and my family, my paternal family, from the coast. So the simple answer would be no. But again, challenging those notions, even the geographical divisions, help to view that we as a region are more connected. And this is how not just the Incas, but many Andean societies operated and connected resources, the use of land, the understanding of weather and resources, and even the distribution of populations. And after that realization is why that those knowledges are not available as they should. Recognizing those traditions of knowledge that come in Quechua, that come from Quechua people, and that help us to even reshape our understanding of culture and society, made me question like why is not widely available, and not just because they are a set of practices and traditions, but because they offer different perspectives on how we do things. For instance, in sometimes in Western society, we tend to put the individual first. That's uh, something we have to navigate with. But in the Andes, collaboration, and there's a term in Quechua called Aini, which is basically highlights the sense of reciprocity that that should not just be something we could do research on, but we could actually change our dynamics to put it in practice, and therefore make sure that if we notice that Quechua language is in connection or exists in connection with the speakers and with the knowledge keepers from that language, then create the spaces or facilitate the spaces for those voices to be more visible. So in my work, I've been trying to, yes, do research on the language and the region, but also we found very important to work with speakers, with communities, and also particularly in the United States, to work with what we might call heritage speakers, descendants of Quechua speakers who are fully from the United States, but at the same time they are understanding U.S. American identity in a different way, in the sense that it's not about passive assimilation, but about reclaiming cultural heritage to build and a more multicultural society. I've been teaching Quechua at the university level for some years, and sometimes people ask me if my students are learning Quechua so they can go back to their countries, and sometimes they even do it in a good sense because they assume they are from Peru, from Bolivia, or Ecuador, and I say, well, I mean, some of them might be from Peru or from Bolivia, but we have a lot of students who are from Chicago, from New York, from Boston, and they are not going back. They feel like they're from their hometowns. At the same time, they have a different understanding of what a U.S. American is, uh, and 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 therefore that sense of that also makes me think that the presence of diaspora communities challenges the views of indigeneity as timeless or pure, that doesn't move, that remains in the past. One of the poster pictures we have about Quechua is Machu Picchu, which is great, but sometimes that looks again rigid, that doesn't change. So with my work, and the work that we have been doing in collaboration with many people, I also want to think that Quechua speakers and their descendants in the diaspora spaces, such as in the United States, could be the DC area or New York or Miami, they also help expand Quechua, and they contribute to the relevance of the language for the present and the future. And in the past few years, I've been there then working on an initiative called the Quechua Alliance, and we every year we promote gatherings of Quechua students, but also enthusiasts. We don't require people to speak Quechua. They are community events to promote a sense of community, even though it's redundant. But it's a kind of like a one day where people sing music, but we also have a Quechua innovation fair. We have a special guest, and we also have moments for debrief and to meet other people. We started in 2015, and first with 20 people, and now, well, before the pandemic, we had up to 200 people coming to the event from across the United States, and sometimes they don't only come from let's say big cities. They come even from rural areas. And I remember that we had one person coming from West Virginia, and we asked her, after of course welcoming her, what brought you to come here, because it's not an academic event. It's not we don't give a certificate. It's in the sense that people come for the pure joy of being there. And her response is, because I want to be part of a community. And that was really nice and inspiring. And we've seen that through that event. It's an annual event. We've seen many diverse communities. For example, is an intergenerational event. We work with elders. And we work with young people, we work with immigrants, but we also have had groups of adoptees who are reconnecting. And we've seen that after meeting at the Quechua Alliance gatherings, some other initiative related to the Andes and Quechua have started. So we are glad that those initiatives that we started with other friends and colleagues can be useful to the community. So to don't expand too much, I try to see that my work on Quechua first made me more committed and passionate to devote the work, let's say, to make that my professional focus. In the past, I started a Quechua program at the University of Pennsylvania, and we were able to offer classes and to facilitate the scholarships to Quechua speakers, to create an academic infrastructure of that. But that's more academic, that's more what I do as my work. But at the same time, I thought it would be very important to have a community-oriented branch of what we do, and that also allows us to have more presence of musicians or writers or activists, and so that people can know more about it and feel proud of the culture. Because we can say in the abstract that yes, Quechua has a lot of knowledge, but maybe we don't have the resources available to us. And I'm mostly thinking on young people who are, fortunately, colleges are becoming more diverse in terms of the student population, but they are still need to become more diverse on what they offer. They need to appeal to what the students are, to the students' cultural background. Sometimes these are not my words, but some people point out that universities have two options now. The option number one is to admit more diverse students, because this is how the country's becoming, but not change their structures and therefore put the burden into the students. Or the second option is to, yes, accept those diverse, let's say the diverse body of the students, but let themselves to change and adapt. And that includes creating more spaces to recognize disciplines and traditions of knowledge that for so long were overlooked or just seen as objects of a study, but not as traditions of knowledge. So in that sense, I hope, along with other colleagues contribute in a meaningful way. One thing that, along with another colleague, we are working on a paper about Quechua speakers in New York City, is that sometimes some people see that the use of Quechua in the diaspora is more, some people consider it might be more of a curious moment rather than a, let's say, powerful space that could contribute to the advance of the language. And they might have a point, because in the sense that that certainly in the US, speaking Spanish is already a challenge. It's already seen as a second level status for many people. So if we already have that with Spanish, which is a widely spoken language, it's one of the most spoken language in the world, and used by the Latin American and Latinx community, what can we expect then from languages like Quechua that are minoritized and have these, even a bigger stigma, even within their own countries? To not just point to Quechua, we can say Nahuatl or Zapotec or Mayan languages. However, what I've been able to see in spaces like the Washington, D.C. area or New York is that first, speakers are very connected to their home countries, especially the elders. And then the young speakers, they have the generational distance to see the value of the heritage their family carries. Because sometimes immigrants, they had to escape their spaces and deny themselves, which is terrible. In the case of Peru, for instance, we had a period of violence in the 80s and 90s. And according to the Truth Commission, 75% of the people that were killed during that period were speakers of indigenous languages. So of course, it's totally understandable that migrants from that period don't want to speak the language, but they still carry traditions and they are still connected to their hometowns. Therefore, heritage speakers, they might not even speak the language. They might understand a little bit, they might recognize some words, but they have then more tools, and they have the opportunity to engage with other Quechua speakers from different regions, because Quechua is still very isolated. People who speak Quechua from Ayacucho might not know the Quechua from Cochabamba, even though they are the same type of Quechua. Quechua is a language family, but the Quechua from Bolivia and the south of Peru belongs to the same family. They just have different dialects, but they don't speak with each other. An English speaker knows that if they go to the UK and they say fish and chips, we're talking about French fries or potatoes, right? But that doesn't happen much in the Andes due to isolation and discrimination. If two Quechua speakers meet in Lima, they won't speak. They are likely not speaking in Quechua. They will speak in Spanish. But that could happen, and that is actually happening in diasporic spaces. So one big contribution, all of this background, is because that in the US or Spain or Italy, I'm more familiar with the US case, Quechua speakers get together and they start to learn and embrace the diversity of the language. And therefore, when I teach Quechua at the university level, I don't only use the variety I know, but I'm also purposely incorporating the different words, expressions, and varieties of other Quechua types and that's something that I've been learning a lot from Quechua speakers, and that could be, and I think that is a great contribution for the community in the diaspora in the US, but also a great contribution for Quechua at large. That these could be a space, these by saying the United States or these Quechua communities in the diaspora, to foster a better understanding of the different varieties of Quechua. The displacement that many heritage speakers feel requires healing, and through that healing process, we open up and we bond. And I can't, unfortunately or fortunately, because maybe my reaction could be enough to say that by accompanying those processes and learning from that, I have shaped my own ways of teaching and working with Quechua communities. So, and probably that's why we have the Quechua Alliance and other initiatives, because of the way how the youth and the heritage speakers have inspired us to facilitate that. Because most my work is mostly academic, but many of those initiatives have happened in cultural centers or in somebody's house. What we're just doing is to put it in a new space where fortunately we see more people of Andean descent now going to college, and we want them to carry that heritage along with their professional lives. But sometimes historically, those official institutions feel like they kind of like look for other understandings of culture when things are changing and are changing also with initiatives like this one. So people can also see themselves represented in their in their idea of belonging to this country, and not just feeling represented in a superficial way. Because sometimes, and probably you might be aware, representation matters, but meaningful representations. It's not just about saying, "Oh, that we have that picture. Thank you for including that picture there." But in this project, for the kind of questions you're facilitating, is also epistemological representation and an identity representation, and feeling welcome, but also feeling empowered to adapt the space into a way that makes sure that people feel proud and comfortable on, in this case, speaking a language or displaying a culture. Many people come to our Quechua classes or the Quechua Alliance or the different activities we try to facilitate with the doubt of how much can I claim that to be part of this, or what if I don't know anything? Maybe why should I get involved into this? And we first need to be aware of the colonial legacy into Latin American identities. But also, for those who are immigrants, right? There's terms like Hispanic or Latino, Latinx that might feel a bit conflictive. Since before coming to the US, immigrants, we tended to identify by our nationalities. But in general, of course, Latinidad and Hispanic identity also, it allows us to embrace a local identity, a US identity that feels closer to our stories, traditions, and values. I see the value of Latin identity. But of course, it can be still problematic because the term highlights the European heritage and overlooks our rich indigenous and Afro cultures which are still alive. So I just want to mention that in Latin America, people use the term mestizo to acknowledge both influences. But as Bolivian scholar and activist Silvia Rivera Cusicanqui suggests, the concept of mestizaje tends to dilute indigenous cultures in favor to the European or Spanish ones. And Rivera Cusicanqui offers a very interesting alternative, cheje, a term in Aymara language, or chachchi, it would be in Quechua, that comes from the way textiles are woven in the Andes. And from far away, these identities might look gray, but as we approach them, those textiles, as we approach them, we can see the individual black and white threads that make them up. Therefore, I like to think that our identities are not just an homogeneous mix, but a constant and vibrant intersection of Spanish, North American, and indigenous threads or yarns. Intention, of course, but a textile in the making. So again, I really like the title of this initiative. People go, I don't know, maybe go to France or to the Napa Valley, and they would probably go to a fancy room with a sommelier, a specialist in wines, and make you a wine tasting in a very fancy way. And you would say, of course, that we need that space because that represents, you know, the person study a lot. They do a lot of, there's a lot of practices connected to that knowledge. It's prestigious, and so on. But why we don't, I don't say it has to be the same way, but why we don't assume the same complexity and even prestige of what's behind quinoa or what's behind potatoes. I was just last week in at 14,000 feet of altitude, and at that altitude, quinoa can't grow because it's too high. So people have to go, I think, down to 10,000 feet of altitude. It's still quite high, right? But that requires the particular knowledge, and they don't walk with a compass. They just go there and they look at the conditions, the kind of land, and then they say, okay, this is the place where we can grow our quinoa. And in order for us to now enjoy that and talk about it as a superfood, how much Quechua speakers, indigenous peasants are part of the conversation, the answer is I don't see any. And if we see them, they're very few. So hopefully, again, what we've been talking, the recognition of the language comes with an epistemological change, but always in connection to the speakers, to the empowerment of the speakers. Because if not, then it just becomes another commodity into the ecosystem of narratives. But if we tie them to speakers, to those traditions of knowledge, then that has to come with more concrete representation.